George Day has been the fire chief and has done a whole lot of things in the town of Warwick for a very, very long time, and he has granted us his time, so that he can explain to us some of the wells in Mount Grace. Thank you very much, George, for coming.
Okay. So, most of the information that I'm going to relay, I have first-hand knowledge of some of it, because I've worked with the town spring for the fountain. And some of the information I've gleaned from records of the town report. And then one story I'm going to tell has been passed on to me by some former citizens of the town that are no longer with us. Now these springs, most of them are still there. They're located, if you look across Fred Lincoln's field over here and you look at the woods, probably 300, 400 feet up into the woods, there's a row of springs. There's 9 of them. 3 of them are on the right-hand side of the road that goes up to the tower, and the rest are on the left-hand side, on the south side. The Warwick Inn had one. The First Parish and Religious Society parsonage had one. Jocelyn, the house that was down around the corner that has been removed. The Cook Farm, that's the barn that's still there that Olivia uses. They had one. And then Goldsberry and Hedge, they shared one. That's where Croak, Liz, and Greenwall, they shared one. The school had one. And then there's the Spring House. Over there between those 2 buildings, you can see a brick building that looks like an outhouse. 7 houses here in the center of town shared a spring that went through there. And I got a pretty funny story to tell about that. But Ryan, or Howard Anderson, that was one. And then Rena Stevens, it's now Cook. Norman and Gertrude Cook, across the street from the town hall. Holbrook, the store, and the storehouse. 7 were fed by that unit that went into the spring house. The Lincolns have a spring up there. That's one that is still being used. It feeds the yellow house, and now the house where Clyde Perkins Jr. lives. That's where Esther and Charles lived. Charles was a brother of Fred Lincoln, so they shared a spring, and it's still in use. And then the town fountain. That's the other one that's still in use.
What was that one, George? I'm sorry.
Town fountain.
The town phone, okay.
Yeah, that's for the town fountain.
Yeah.
And I'll get into that later. I'll tell you a funny story about the spring house. The water from the fountain goes into the spring house, into a tube. And out of that tube, there were 7 nipples. And out of each nipple, it fed these 7 houses. Now, back in the days when these springs were first started, the first use of them, everybody had hand pumps, you know. And then in the 30s, when we got electricity in town, pumps started going in. And people would maybe have a flush toilet eventually, and then they'd have bathtubs, and they'd have showers, and they'd have kids. And, you know, in the early days, that spring house fed these 7 units pretty good. But then later on, there were some problems. And some of the owners used to sneak in there and they'd pinch the nipple on a couple of the, so that more water would go to them. Because, you know, the water from each nipple went into a cistern in the cellar of each house. And then they had a hand pump out of that, and then eventually the electric water pump. And after bathtubs, toilets, washing machines, you know, it just became too much to handle. So that's why I started pinching the. And I'm not.
Did that shut the water off in that house, or just
No,
lower
just it would just shut off the water to that one of the 7 houses.
And it would shut the water off completely?
Well, it would slow it down.
Okay, that's what I meant.
Yeah.
Would they know that somebody
Oh
did
no,
that?
it would slow it down so that more would go into the nipples that weren't pinched. And it got so bad, I understand, that they had to put a padlock on the door, and they gave the key to somebody from another part of town that didn't have anything to do with it, that was trusted with that key.
Yeah.
Now, eventually, you know, people started getting off of this system. The Warwick Inn was one of the first that I remember. They put in a driven well. That's the well where you have a arrangement where they raise a block and boom, boom. And then people started to put in drilled wells, you know, like most everybody has today. But the inn has a driven well. And you know, people try to call driven wells and drilled wells artesian wells. They're really not artesian wells. An artesian well is one that has enough pressure so it bubbles over all the time on its own. That's the definition of an artesian well. All the others are just a driven well or a drilled well. I have a drilled well. Katrina has an artesian well where she lives. That one bubbles off all the time, bubbles out all the time. We had to
You have
put.
to have a pump though still to bring it up?
Yeah, it has a pump in there, so you have pressure for the shower and all that. But we had to put a drain pipe in to drain the excess water off down behind the house. Otherwise, it would follow the pipe into the cellar, flood the cellar. I just thought I'd mention that, you know, that everything is not really an artesian well, even though people call it that. Now, I think the first one to go off the well house over here was the Cooks. Gertrude Cook, she put in a drilled well. And then when the town bought the Historical Society from her, that went off, because that was one of the units that was the McKim Cottage. That was on that system. That was one of the 7. So that went off. And then I can remember when Gary Williams, when he ran the store, he put a drilled well in for the store and the storehouse. The last 2 remaining ones on that system, well, Holbrook, he put in a drill well. And the last 2 was Chris Ryan and the cook. And just before Chris Ryan sold the house, he put in a drilled well, which Cook and that house share. It's Connor and Danielle Anthony. They live there now. So the only springs that are still running now is the Lincoln House, the Lincoln 2 houses, and the town fountain.
And Clyde Jr. And Clyde Jr.
In Clyde Jr., yeah. Them 2 houses, yeah.
What about the library, George? What about the library?
I'll get to that.
Oh, okay.
I'll get to that. Now, I looked in some of the old town reports, and in 1929, after the school burned, there was a committee appointed to come forward with some suggestions for some water sources in the center of town. They brought forth to a special town meeting in the summer of 1929 to appropriate $3,000 for a tank to be located at the Howard property that would contain 54,000 gallons. And then they wanted to have some wells situated around the center of town for added fire protection. And then this was a brainchild of Dr. Goldsberry. He was big on this. Where the Lincoln Springs are located and where the fountain spring is located and where the school spring, on the right-hand side, there's a natural bowl up there. And Doc Goldsberry was pushing to have a dam put in up there and create a reservoir for the center of town. Well, lo and behold, the only thing that was voted on at that town meeting, the committee brought in these suggestions, but the only thing that was the wells. They appropriated $500 to put wells. They didn't do the $3,000 tank or the $6,000 reservoir. And then later on, well, they voted to put wells in Edith Lincoln or the Holbrook place, another one down at Seymour's, and another one at the Bass property.
Where's Seymour's?
Well, where Hetty Bell Farm is now. Where Hetty Bell Farm is now. And another one at Etta Bass, or Catherine Bass's house. Later on, they rescinded that vote, and all they did was put a small reservoir down behind the Bass place on Revere Hill. You used to be able to see the remains of the cement dam there. It's all gone now. But that's where one of the water sources was. And the other one was to build a water hole on the parsonage land down off the Northfield Road. And that is still there. Don Matthews owns the parsonage now, and he had the property surveyed, and that water hole is there. It's still there on that property down there. So then, I think what changed things is, in the October of 1929 was the stock market crash, and we had the Depression start during the 30s, and then World War II in the 40s. So really nothing was ever done. In the 50s, just about the time I moved to town, is when they finally did put a tank over here on the Howard property, right beside the inn. It doesn't contain 54,000 gallons like they originally proposed. It's half that. It's 27,000 gallons that's in that tank over there. And believe me, that's really come in handy for some fires that we've had. And it's also good for filling the trucks if they have a fire out of town somewhere and they come back, they can refill the trucks there. It's been a pretty good source of water. Now the town fountain was put in 1900, a gift of Mrs. Thayer in memory of her father, Captain Ball. And I've seen in some of the records that I've researched that in 1900 they paid a bunch of guys some money to dig a trench from the fountain up to the spring on the mountain. 1930, I've seen in the town reports where they appropriated $700 to redo that pipeline up to that spring. And up until that time, the only thing that was fed off that spring was the fountain. In the 50s, when this water tank was put over here, the 27,000 gallon, that's when they decided to feed the overflow from the fountain into that tank to keep it topped off. I can remember when that was done, when I first moved to town, 57, 58. I can remember when they put that tank in, and then the overflow from the fountain used to just go down in the ground, but they piped it over to that tank so it keeps it topped off. In the late 70s, the Firemen's Association, under my direction, took it on themselves to remove the fountain and take it down to Rodney Hunt's and have it refurbished. If some of you might remember when the fountain sat on the edge of the road, you could actually drive around it. It was tarred around it. And then there was that road that went in front of the library, the on-ramp, that I called it. But when we had it refurbished, Northfield Sand and Gravel was kind enough to donate a cement tank that we put further into the grass area to make a new base for setting the fountain on when it come back after being refurbished. It was easier to work on. We have a manhole, we can get down in there, we can work on the piping. Before that, the fountain just sat on a walled up, like a well, and it was hard to work on it. Yeah. So this made it easier to work on. In 1984, the town appropriated from revenue sharing money to redo the line up to the spring from the fountain. The job was given to Sykes Construction, and they dug a trench from the fountain all the way up to the spring and put in plastic pipe, 1.5 inches in diameter. So today the fountain is fed by that 1.5 inch pipe. It comes into a distribution manifold down in that vault under the fountain. And from there, there's a valve that feeds the library. The library has water from that system, as well as the fountain. And the overflow still goes into the tank. And then it was decided at that time to put a line across the common and come into the town hall. So the town hall is fed off of that spring now. When we hooked it all up, everything was working fine. There was enough pressure, enough gravity feed to run the sinks in the bathroom and run the sinks in the kitchen. You know, it was working fine, except for the toilets. It wouldn't provide enough pressure to run the flush-o-matic toilets that are required, you know, in a place like this. You can't have normal flush toilets because it takes too long to refill after the flushing, so you have the flush-o-matics that go, you know, the urinals and the toilets. So we had to put a water pump in the system down here in the basement of the, but it's still fed by the spring from the mountain. Now, when we brought the fountain back from Rodney Hunt's, it was refurbished pretty good, and one of the valves down under the fountain can run the jug filler, as we call it, you know, the main thing for people to fill water bottles and jugs. But then in the summertime, we were running the 4 fishes' heads that are on the pedestal. But something happened there, and one of them became disconnected, and so in the last couple of years, we haven't been able to do that. One other thing that I mentioned is, you look at the fountain, there's a couple of things on the side of the pedestal, and they were designed to hold a drinking cup. In the early days, every fountain had a drinking cup. We had 2, and it was like a metal cup, and it had a chain, and it was chained to the, so if somebody used it, they couldn't run off with it, they had to put it back, you know, because it was chained to the fountain. 1920, the state passed a law prohibiting public drinking cups at public fountains. I suspect that maybe it had something to do with being right after the 1918 flu epidemic. Had something to do with that. So those little cup holders are still there, but there's no cups on them. Every now and then I'll see a plastic cup on it that somebody's left. But I just wanted to mention that. Now,
Question about the fountain. Was that originally put in by the Women's Temperance Union?
no,
No, okay.
no. This woman from Winchester, Mrs. Edward Thayer, she was a daughter of Captain Ball. She donated it and put it in. And when that fountain went in, it was a godsend to the town, because not only did it provide drinking water for people whose wells went dry or they wanted a water source, but the bowl was set up for horses to drink out of. And then down around the base is another place where water would fill up, and it was for dogs and sheep and other animals, chickens or whatever, you know. And you know, today it's basically just used for ornamental and then to drinking water. And a lot of people come from far and near, you know, to fill up a water bottle. I've seen people from Athol, Orange, come up, fill up water jugs. And, you know, Ann Kilroy lives over at the Holbrook I've seen her walk over and fill up bottles with water. I think the people that rent the storehouse, they come over and get water there. It's
It's really great during a winter storm outage.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you're at the fountain getting
Yeah.
water and swapping stories, if you can get to the
Oh,
fountain.
definitely, I've done that.
So I think, oh, one other thing, when we put the line in to come to the town hall, there's a T over here on the line, and a line goes into the cellar of the Historical Society, but it's not used, it's just sitting there, plugged off. But if it ever came to where the Historical Society wanted to put in a bathroom and running water, the line is there. So,
Somebody told me once that there was a cow that broke the line once.
oh, that,
Oh, I-
okay, now,
No,
I should mention that.
When we lived in the parsonage.
You know, one of the reasons why it was decided to hire Sykes to put an 1.5-inch line up to the spring was with modern equipment, with a backhoe, he could bury it 5 or 6 foot down. When they would dig in these hand trenches to put the pipe in, they'd only bury it like a foot down. And then if you had cows running around the field up there, mucking around, they'd step on the line and break it. Oh yeah, we had to repair the fountain line a couple of times because you could always find it because the water would be spurting up out of the ground.
When Calvin and I lived at the parsonage in 61, 62, we had that happen.
Yeah.
And we didn't have any water, and it was a cow had
Yeah,
stepped on the.
yeah, I forgot to mention that.
Yeah.
And no, and like I say, the only two that are still running is the Lincoln. Fred did bury a new line from his spring down there, a copper line, years ago. He buried a copper line on the edge of the field down to his house, and then it also feeds Estes and Charles, and where Clyde Perkins Jr. lives now. And then the fountain, the only two that are still running.
At Charlie Lincoln's house, I can remember there used to be a big barn there, and then the kitchen was between the barn and the house that's there now. And there was a great big tank, and the water ran in and out all the time,
Yeah,
all the time. That never stopped. Now, when Sue lived there, we used to go down. Yeah, it was always running. I thought it was the funniest thing I ever saw.
Shut that faucet off.
Well, I moved from Orange.
I can remember.
And you can shut it off.
I can remember when drilled well was put in at the Goldsberry house. It's when Gowder and Buddy lived there. They got sick of fooling around with the system, and they put in a drilled well. I don't know whether Audrey did it right after them or not, but I know both of them have got drill wells now.
When we first bought that little house, Stevens property in the center of town, there was like a big tub or whatever in the kitchen and a line that the water just ran into.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Into that, and then ran out. There was no.
Yeah, and see, probably in the
No.
in the original days, when you had just a hand pump, you know, people used to draw water for cooking, maybe sponge bath, you know, whatever. And then when tubs come along, maybe a couple of people put tubs in and they'd heat up the water and dump it in. But then eventually when electric pumps come along, that was the demise of the system.
George, I'm curious, is there any other place in Warwick where there are spring-fed moments, or is this just all related to Mount Grace? And I'm
I'm-
just curious.
You know, I'm sure there is, but I can't really.
There's one up been back of my house in the field, up and back, up on the side hill of Old Winchester Road.
Yeah,
There's, water runs out down through there all the time,
yeah.
up on that side hill.
There was one on the Northfield Road, and that might be the one that's connected with the parsonage, and we used to, when
Yeah, you used
the
to
kids
get
were
up,
young, we'd go
yeah.
over to St. Mary's, and we'd stop every Sunday to bring water over
Right,
to the
yeah.
priest from that.
A lot of people
From that
used to go to
spring,
Wendell
yeah.
Road,
Yeah.
yeah.
So I don't know whether that would be the same one or not.
No, that spring down on the window, that was a separate one.
That's a different one.
I think that one still runs.
Yeah, yeah.
And then there's, and then there's another one down at the old Iron Bridge, you know, down,
Yeah, yeah.
there was a spring down there that people used to come from out of town and fill. Yeah.
A lot more than we know, really. There's a lot more springs than you,
Yes.
Yeah.
most of us know.
So anyways, that's about it for me. Any other comments or questions?
Great stories.
Really interesting, yeah.
Well, thank you very much, George.
And I'm glad for having it taped for posterity, that's great.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, it is, that's
Yeah, it
wonderful
is.
information.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.